All right, so this is our first interview on our new Learn DGLux channel, and today we're talking to Jonathan Chao, who's a UI UX designer for Distech at Acuity and DGLogik, of course. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and say a few words about his general job responsibilities and day to day, and then we'll dive right in. So go ahead, John, and let's introduce you to the audience here.
Okay, hey everyone. I'm John Chao. I'm the senior UX designer here with DGLogik or Distech and Acuity. I've been with the professional services team for about five years, a little more than 5 years. I work alongside several UI and UX designers. I personally primarily focus on research, wireframing, prototyping, some interaction design, but not so much UI. We kind of have some dedicated UI designers who specialize in that area. When I'm not working, I like to go mountain biking, I fly drones, I play tennis, and I play video games.
That's awesome. So next, so we're going to talk about UI UX kind of design approach, but we're going to try to stick to the DGLux context. Basically, we're going to talk a bit about how DGLux affects maybe the typical UI UX workflow, and kind of little caveats that you may run across while dealing with DGLux projects. So the first question specifically about working with DGLux. So when you tasked with the project, starting from initial discovery and all the way to the production, how would you say DGLux makes it different from maybe your more typical software development project? And if you can mention specifically where maybe it makes it a bit more difficult or easier, then it'll help us understand how do UX designers fit into the whole DGLux ecosystem.
Yeah, so DGLux5, its strength is that our developers are able to kind of create custom applications with very little front-end coding knowledge or even kind of back-end coding knowledge. Those ones you kind of have to learn more complex back-end knowledge to be able to produce something that's visually appealing, that works well, it's responsive. So a lot of clients who come to us like to use us to kind of like pilot projects or to prototype. We can build full-fledged applications relatively fast, mainly because we don't spend a whole bunch of time, figuring out how to do X, Y, and Z, because DGLux5 has so many intuitive components built into the software that makes it easy for us to connect it to data and then design a front-end kind of application and connect it to. So I'd say one of the strengths is definitely the flexibility of DGLux, and that's kind of why a lot of customers come to us to build out some of their applications.
Okay, and if I may chime in, since I'm not exactly an innocent bystander here, and I have been a one-man team for DGLux before that we had a proper kind of UI UX procedures. What I kind of want to add to this is one of the key strengths that had always made me quite happy is ability for rapid adjustments, where you can, in some cases, you can literally make adjustments minutes before the production, or before the sign-off meetings or other things, where customer can sometimes see their ideas presented right away without necessarily another cycle or another sprint, which is typical for other platforms. Sorry, Al, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally correct. And that's kind of why, as a UX designer on the design team, it's really fun working with the developers because, if a new feature comes in that we didn't expect or some change to the existing application that they need addressed right before kind of the release, I can just, hop on a call with one of our developers and say like, hey, can you try this out? And they can build it. And then if it's, something that works and it's useful to the end user, then, it gets incorporated right into the final product.
How about maybe a few words about, I wouldn't say negative, but kind of important factors that someone has to keep in mind working with DGLux environment rather than just general kind of ID for example, kind of limitations on some of the features or maybe efficiency of certain features or others. How's that affecting your work?
Yeah, so I mean, with all kind of software, there's always some features that we have to be aware of. Like, for example, if a lot of clients who come to us have a requirement to visualize kind of alarms across their buildings or whatever whatever they're using an alarm console for, and alarms at a high level seem relatively easy, but being able to kind of figure out how to kind of send commands if that's even something that you want to do and its cascading impact on the application can be tricky. In terms of actually using DGLux as a software, while it is easy to or relatively easy to actually build an application, you do have to pretty thoroughly learn, some shortcuts to use certain components, whether it's charts, tables, it could be repeaters. There's a whole bunch of different aspects of DGLux that can make your life easier, but at the same time, it's you do have to spend some time to actually learn how to use the software itself. So sometimes we'll get requests from customers that may seem really easy at the surface level to implement, but when we actually go out to build it, it can take a significant amount of time that the customer may not understand. But in terms of implementation wise, it's more complex. There's a whole bunch of different moving components that we definitely have to be aware of and cognizant of.
Right. So yeah, obviously you talk about situations where the benefit of tiny change somewhere could be almost insignificant, while the increase in development effort could be very significant, right? So it's kind of knowing those small pitfalls is probably what makes kind of a good DGLux5 UI UX designer stand apart from kind of your general run-of-the-mill UI UX designer.
So let's start from the beginning, right? So can you describe how your typical project starts, right? From the moment that your project manager involves you and brings you into the team meeting and announces the project. So from that step, how does it typically start, and where do you go from there?
Yeah, so when we get a new project, it's always fun. Yeah, our project manager comes to me with kind of a list of requirements, usually from the client who, wants to build out a certain type of application. Right. Sometimes this has, kind of notes about the end user, who they're trying to build the application for. Maybe what type of screen size they're designing for, where it's going to be located. But more often the case, they're not that detailed. So what would happen after is I would review those requirements. Then I would, me and the project manager would kind of schedule a call with the client, and we would hop off on kind of a kickoff meeting to really take a deeper dive into those requirements to really flesh out those ideas. And if I've come up with any kind of sketches, we can, show some preliminary designs. And if the client has any kind of general concepts, we can hear those and take those into account. Yeah, so in these kickoff meetings, we definitely discuss requirements, but it's also an opportunity for me to really try to understand where these requirements have come from. Did they do their due diligence? Did they talk to end users? Is what they're trying to produce, founded in some research, and they're really trying to tackle a goal for the user. Sometimes you get project managers or clients who kind of think that they know it all, that they have a bright idea, and they want to build out an application to potentially solve it, right? But that's not really what we aim to do as UX designers. We try to figure out who you're designing for, how are they going to use it, what goal are they trying to accomplish, and what are the most important goals that they're trying to accomplish. And from there, you can build an application. So it's kind of a balance between trying to figure out, where is the client coming from if it's not explicitly stated in their requirements documents, and where is there an opportunity where I can do some research to help try to shape the outcome of the application itself.
All right. So if I understand you correctly, so what you're talking now is basically managing your clients. So trying to make sure that rather than executing client's idea about how something should look and function, you're trying to basically better understand the client's need and then professional design interface around the need rather than around client's ideas of how it should or could work. But it is a fine line. Quite a few customers would often consider themselves quite avid, designers.
Right.
And sometimes they're quite resistive. So how do you approach situations where a client may be somewhat resistive to accept other ideas if they're not exactly what he envisioned initially?
Right. So those are always tough. It's when I produce kind of wireframes or concepts of applications, at the end of the day, if the client has a requirement that they want us to meet, I'm going to meet it, right? And if they had a specific idea in mind, sure, I can produce a wireframe or concept that illustrates that idea. But if I think that there may be a better way to address a certain pain points, then I often, create a secondary sketch or wireframe to show to the client to try to kind of illustrate to them that maybe you've been so set on this idea, but there might be a different solution to a problem. And that's also good because we can kind of like A/B test the ideas with end users, right? To see, is their idea, the best way to do something, or is another idea a equally or better way of accomplishing a goal.
Right. So from my personal experience, from my times where I did have to dabble into kind of UI UX design, often you just need to demonstrate why their idea may have an issue, in my experience. So if you just generally say like, nah, this is just not how you do it,
Right.
typically you meet resistance, especially if the client thinks that they're pretty good at this. However, if you break it down literally for either navigational logic or to the literally like conflicts of workflows, and show like, look, if we do it your way, this is where you're going to run into issues, or this is where you basically paint yourself into a corner with this approach. I would say 90% of times you would get an agreement, right? Maybe initially in some details, and eventually in the whole concept. At least that's my personal experience, and working with you, I know you've had those as well. So that the method seems to work. But every now and then there are those guys that just don't budge, and
Exactly.
sometimes you actually have to make something, make it work, and make it somewhat real so they can see their problem in actual product.
Yeah.
They would not comprehend sort of the issue on paper. They actually have to see it work or not work to really understand, like, yeah, maybe that wasn't the way to go. So that happens as well. All right,
Yep.
so let's move on to the next, I guess, phase of the project. So now you've met with a client, you hopefully understood what they're trying to achieve, and where do you go from there? I mean, so I know there's several pathways. Personally, you can get into sort of understanding the data, right, to get the supplemental information for for this product, because often kind of data sometimes can have an interesting influence on the UI UX design.
Right.
Or you can go into, I guess, drafts and the wireframing, and then kind of postpone the data. So where do you go with your approach? What's your next step?
Yeah, so I mean, like you said, there's a couple different ways, and it kind of depends on the data readiness from the client. If they have certain KPIs that they want us to show on the application, I definitely review that, because it totally influences how I visualize certain metrics in an application. But generally, I take the list of requirements, and I kind of start with wireframing a couple of different ideas about how the navigation can be structured given the list of requirements, and then starting to fill in the content once I figure out, okay, this is kind of a logical workflow a user might take throughout an application. And it's a constant iterative process where I'll design something, then see a requirement that maybe something that I designed didn't really work out, or doesn't really work well with maybe the navigation that I've constructed. So I'll iterate upon that. I'll talk with project managers and developers to see, maybe, what's the best way to visualize something, right? Am I doing this the right way? Is this intuitive enough for them and potentially the end user? And if I have access to, potential end users, I'm more than happy to get them involved, or stakeholders, to see if what I am sketching or wireframing makes sense to them. It's what they expect to see in the type of application. But in general, the next stage is sketching, it's wireframing, it's iterating upon ideas, talking to stakeholders, developers, in order to kind of produce the shell of an application.
Okay, so next, I guess sub point that's kind of near and dear to me. When do you, I guess, have that first conversation with developers, with folks who are going to be executing on your, on your designs? So when does that conversation take place? What do you talk about? And basically, what's the purpose of this?
Yeah, so it really depends on the complexity of the application. I kind of have a general sense of what we can and can't do in DGLux, and more often the case we can do it, but it just may be a bit more complicated. And that's kind of a part of my job, is to balance feasibility of what I'm designing with kind of the most ideal end user experience. So depending on the complexity, I love to try to get developers involved, talking to you, Paul, or anyone else, to see, is what I'm designing feasible? Can we tweak one of our existing widgets to meet these requirements, right? Other times, it's a relatively straightforward application, and I just design it, and then we review it with the team internally. And if maybe before we show it to the client, and if we can't do it some way, then I'll tweak it, review it again, and then we finally kind of show it to the clients and see if we've addressed all of their concerns.
Yeah, I think the key word I heard there was before. So,
Yeah.
just talking to developers, for all of you out there, talking to developers before you commit to your client, commit certain designs to your client, I think is critical. Again, coming from a kind of development engineering side of this, and often having to kind of take and execute on designs, I can say for sure, I can say that you know, ask your developers, be nice to them. So run your designs by your developers. Make sure that they can be executed efficiently. Because like we mentioned before, sometimes what may seem like a small design element to a client and even to your UI UX designer may actually incur hours and hours of development time for almost no benefit, simply because maybe the people who made a decision, for example, to make this behave like this, just they didn't have any information as far as just how efficient or inefficient this would be to implement. So again, talk to your developers before you talk to your clients when you're looking for a sign off. And we are moving on to the next to the next phase of the project. So next we're going to talk about something that most of us don't really like that much. Kind of late stage changes in the requirements. Right? They happen to the best of us, well, to every one of us, to be honest, and they can be quite frustrating and distractive to everyone. So, how do you deal with this later stage requirement changes? And specifically, I'm talking about after the development has started or some development has already been completed, because we know that typically with DGLux, we don't wait for the whole design to be ready sometimes. Sometimes we just take them in pieces where if you have a good chunk already done, and then we can start the development while maybe other areas of the project are still in design. So let's say a development has already begun, some or significant amount of work has already been done, and you get that email or call from the client saying, "Uh-oh, something has changed, or we have to go another way with the design." So, how do you deal with this? What are the repercussions of something like that? And how do you try to keep things running smoothly?
Right. Yeah, and we know that things can change while building this application or even designing this application for any number of reasons, right? It may be like a different data structure that they're using, or they've realized that they've actually targeted the wrong kind of market and they need to pivot to a different to address a different set of users, right? Once development has started, it it becomes a lot more time consuming and costly to change, because we tend to go through a kind of a three-phase project process where we do wireframing first, right? Client signs off, and that's where we kind of lock down the structure of an application, the content of it, right? And then once they sign off, then we go to the UI design phase where you apply a skin to it, to actually make the wireframes kind of resemble the final look and feel of the application. Then that gets signed off, right? So we try to not make that many changes at that stage to actually the UX or structure of the application, and then it'll go on to development, right? So every time we go down this line, and we if the client comes back and says we need to change something, right? If it's a huge change, right, we're going to have to go through the cycle again and make sure that what they're asking for, given what we've already started designing, is is it feasible? Can we is it a change that we can easily accommodate, or does it or will it take a significant amount of time? And we let the client know, like, hey, this is what we have built so far. Here's how we think that we can fit this new feature, this new change into this application. And if it just doesn't work, then and we have to convey to our clients that this is likely going to push back timelines potentially. Uh, and so yeah, it's kind of, it doesn't happen often, but it's kind of unfortunate when it does. I have to say, but we try our best to work around it.
So how do you is there an algorithm or a method that you use to determine what would constitute a change order versus what can still kind of slide under the existing cushion of small tweaks here and there. So how do you make that? Obviously, the project manager makes the final call there, but they likely will come to you for a recommendation and to assess the needed effort. So where do you draw that line? How do you determine that?
It depends on the size of the change, right? If we're just changing some KPIs on the screen, maybe looking at, energy production and consumption versus just production on a chart, that's easy. It's kind of adding a different series to the chart, right? Or if they have an application that has maybe like 3 main sections that are each in kind of like separate tabs, and they wanted to add a 4th section, depending on how complex that extra section is, whether it's like analytics or some other feature like error reporting or something, that is kind of borderline likely to we'll have to kind of issue a change order. And anything that kind of revolves around actual big navigational changes, like if you have maybe initially your project consisted of like you trying to understand your building energy consumption for a single building, but all of a sudden you want to kind of extrapolate that and add a whole bunch of other buildings, then you want to roll that data up to a multi-site level, then you want to roll that up to kind of a global scale, right, to analyze that. That started off as a single building, and it may seem simple just to duplicate that project a couple times, right, and just roll it up. But in theory, it kind of shifts the whole type of navigation of how do you go from like a global overview down to a specific building level, which is kind of a big change and something that we've seen before.
Right. And from me, I would like to add is, so there's this, sometimes there's a unique case where seemingly large or huge change constitutes very little effort on the development side, and that's often related to basically when the change involves adding more of the, for example, of the equipment that's already part of the design. So basically expanding the quantity without changing the functionality much, right? Or requested additions that may only consist of components that already exist elsewhere in the application. So they've already been developed or will be developed by that time. And so it's just a matter of grabbing something that already exists and and piecing it together. And effort could be fairly small, even for what looks like a whole new section. So the reason I'm mentioning this is, again, I can't stress this enough, talk to your developer when making these decisions, because sometimes you get unexpected feedback, or something you may have considered a tiny change and wanted to let it slide may actually be high effort on the development side, and it could be the other way around. So what may seem to you like a large content increase may seem like just a few extra clicks for your developers. So it'd be nice to.
I mean, and that totally makes sense, right? Because some projects that we've done in the past, maybe it's kind of visualizing a whole bunch of different equipment in your building, right? And we'll, from the start, we'll talk with developers and say like, hey, if you're gonna have 300 VAVs in your building, right? Instead of creating a unique page for each VAV, we'll try to like template it, right? So in the case you just need to add an extra one that's relatively simple or similar to one that you created before, it's an easy change or addition that we can make, even if you're adding 1 or 200 extra,
So now, John, let's speak into the area that not many get to see. Your interaction with UI designers, right? So, you deal with user experience. Basically, your job are the workflows, the component locations, relationships between components and pages, and on and on. But at some point, it has to get actually visually designed. And so, how does that interaction look like between you and your designers? Where does it start? How do you go through iterations, and where does it end?
Yeah, so among our team, I specialize in kind of the UX side of things. We have a couple other dedicated more UI designers, who know a little bit about UX, but are great at visualizing elements, turning wireframes into very elegant applications based off of people's style guides. And if they don't have a style guide, then we kind of create our own. Um, and I really rely on them, with their expertise at elevating kind of my wireframes into professional looking applications. So, throughout our design, when I'm designing a wireframe, I kind of get their input into, you know, should I use a toggle switch here, or should I use a checkbox? Given the space that we have to deal with in a specific location in the application, visually, how is one element going to affect the elements around it?
And by the way, let's take a look at how the wireframe or typical wireframe looks like.
So yeah, so as you can see, the wireframe is typically grayscale. It's not very pretty looking. It's a way for us to iterate really rapidly, to test out different ideas. Once those ideas are pretty solid, then it moves on to UI. So we're pretty confident in the how we're visualizing a specific chart, right, or a gauge by the time it hits UI. And so, once my wireframe has been signed off, we can move on to UI. I work really closely with our UI designers to make sure that they're conveying certain elements in the proper manner. Are we giving emphasis to specific buttons, or are we giving less of a emphasis on different elements, based off of what the user is trying to accomplish? So it's really a back and forth kind of a review process with the UI designers. It's a lot of fun. They're very creative and are always open to new ideas.
Okay, so let's actually see how wireframe gets turned into the actual design. So we're going to kind of show them side by side here. And this would be the typical process of turning an idea into a blueprint for developers to execute. Okay, so we've gone through the whole process from kind of initial requirement gathering to produced hi-fi mockups and wireframes, which developers would need to to create a properly designed application. So at that point, I would imagine your full-time involvement with the project ends, but I know you never truly get cut from the project until the project is signed off and accepted by the customer, and even then, you sometimes have to get involved. So, but let's talk about the kind of cases or situations where you do get called back into the project. What are those reasons? Why do you get called back sometimes? How do you deal with those reasons and situations? And basically, where do you draw the line?
Right. So after we kind of complete the UI of a project and it's been signed off, hopefully the developers have been, involved throughout the process. So there's no big surprises, once they actually have to build out the application. But this is, up until this point, all of our designs have mostly been like 2D. There's no kind of animation unless we've done, prototyping, or any kind of interactions. So once developers start actually building our application, or the ideas that we had set forth, this is where we get a lot of feedback from the devs saying like, hey, is this interaction correct? If I click on this, is this supposed to, appear this way? Right. And so that's where a lot of the dialogue happens between the designers and the developers, because we have it visualized, or we think it should be done one way, but then maybe during development, it's totally wrong and looks very counterintuitive. And so then they come back to us and we'll review it back and forth. And so we'll hopefully come to a compromise, that's both feasible, and you know, it's easy to use.
Um, okay, John. So thank you very much for opening this little world of UI UX for us. Not many people get to peek in there. To many, it's just something you do on a napkin, and from there somehow the product gets born. But as you can see, there's quite a bit more effort in there, and there's a system to it as well. So this is not definitely not a free for all there. So it was great. It was great to have you on. This is again our first interview. We'll have more with various folks that are involved in DGLux product development. Meanwhile, thank you for visiting, and let's carry on. And I couldn't think of a ping pong joke, so
Yeah, well,
we'll skip that for now.
okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks for having me, Paul, and hopefully we can play ping pong sometime soon.
Alrighty, and yes, we all miss ping pong. We probably lost our qualifications by now. We've been out of the office for so long. At least I have. I have no ping pong table in sight. But we'll see who got better when we get back to the office. Hopefully, sometimes this century. Okay, thanks everyone.